All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. If you are scrolling by, please stop for this important conversation. My name is Jennifer Storm, and I am the coordinator of advocacy and community outreach with Andreozzi and Foote. And today I'm very excited to be joined by Gemma Hoskins, who's going to tell a little bit about her story. And we're really here to talk about the importance of justice for survivors of sexual violence, specifically childhood sexual violence, and specifically those survivors and victims who have been denied access to justice historically. As we know, this is a massive problem across the country. We have seen report after report from grand juries that have revealed the atrocities that have been hidden and covered up. Specifically, we're going to be talking today about the Catholic Church, but obviously we know that this type of abuse happens in all institutions, school districts, Boy Scouts, all organizations, and has historically been covered up, which has enabled not only predators who have gone unknown and then allowed to have access to other children, but it's helped victims feel powerless, and it's kept them silent for far too long. So we have advocated very strongly at Andreozzi and Foote about breaking that silence. And the way we shatter that silence is through statute of limitation reform. Right now in the state of Maryland, there is a robust effort to eliminate the statute of limitations, open them up for all victims of all ages. And very exciting, it passed the bill, the Child Victims Act, passed the Senate last night and is headed to the House, where it is expected to pass. Now, if you've done this work at all, like Gemma and I have, you know that there are always setbacks and always, you never rely on anything until the governor's signature is on it. And even then, sometimes you have to face court battles. So that's what we're here to talk about today. But Gemma, could you just tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about yourself? And I mean, you have an incredible story. If no one is familiar with the name, I mean, you really are the precipice behind the Netflix documentary, The Keepers. You have dedicated your life to trying to solve the murder of your teacher, and then to go on and help other survivors. So thank you for all of the work that you've done and shattering that silence. But tell us a little bit more about your work.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I want to tell you how much I appreciate you giving me this opportunity, because the more we know, the more we can share. Most of your viewers or listeners probably know me from The Keepers and know that my teacher, who was the inspiration for me becoming a teacher, Sister Kathy Sesnick, was murdered in 1969. And we believe she was murdered because she reported the abuse that was happening in the school and in the surrounding areas, counties, by a priest and his group. It involved not just clergy, but it involved nuns, it involved teachers, it involved police officers, it involved very high-ranking politicians. So that's a whole nother story, and people can see The Keepers for that. But that series came out in May of 2017. I can't believe it's been almost 6 years. And since then, we've learned a whole lot more about the case, but we've also gotten to know a whole lot of really wonderful people who were abused, not just that school, but all over the world. So The Keepers was released in 125 countries in 25 languages. So somebody might be watching me dubbed in Hindi or Spanish. So with that said, what I've learned is that I really feel like I can help people make a difference. Part of it is because I'm not uncomfortable speaking out. Mm-hmm. And I've made a lot of really good connections through The Keepers with the media. So using my 5 minutes of celebrity, I'm able to find resources for people. I'm able to make connections with newspapers and television and radio. And so we can get this story out. As you said, right now in Maryland, we are keeping our fingers crossed. Our General Assembly in Maryland meets from January until April. It's not the same in every state. So right now we have two bills that are very similar. One was worded and written in the House of Delegates, and one came from the Maryland Senate. And as you said earlier, there's a process, and I had no idea how long that process takes. So the process involves the bill being presented, and it's been presented for the last 4 years and never made it out of committee, which means a judiciary committee, I believe it's 11 or 12 senators and 11 or 12 delegates, they discuss it and they take testimony. And so I don't drive, so it's been difficult for me to do that. But this year I had transportation. And so along with a lot of survivors and advocates, I had the honor of testifying for them. So with that said, the Judiciary Committee passed it out of the committee 2 weeks ago. It went to the entire Senate, which I believe is 47 senators, and it passed 45-2, I think. It's close.
It was close, yes.
Is that the number?
42
to 5.
5, yes.
My bad, sorry, 42 to 5. But still, that's overwhelming. And so now we look for the same thing in the House of Delegates, and we think that the delegate that originally wrote the bill, C.T. Wilson, who is also a survivor of childhood abuse, we believe that it's going to go through there pretty quickly. And then we need to have it become a law. And I believe the big voting is at the end of the General Assembly on bills. And our governor is very enthusiastic about this. He's very much in favor of it. So we don't count on anything until we actually hear it and see it. But right now, that's what we're waiting for. So with that said, what this will mean for survivors and their families, because it's a family issue. It impacts everybody around the survivor because of their trauma, and they didn't deserve any of it. So what will happen is that if the bill passes, it's called the Child Victims Act. It means that anybody, no matter what age they are, they could be 95, if they were abused when they were 3, they have access to civil litigation. Now, this might be new learning for some people. A criminal offense, a felony, is usually prosecuted by the state, and that often comes from like a police report. Anybody can file a civil suit. So for many of these survivors who never spoke out, they have the opportunity now. They have access to a suit, access to justice. And I'm just going to say, as an aside, they need to be very, very careful about who they hire as their attorneys. If this passes, it's going to be like Shark City. I hate to say that, but there are a lot of attorneys who are not well versed or experienced in abuse litigation, and that can be very dangerous for a survivor. So they need to really use their own resources, their families, their friends, to vet the right person to represent them. So when that happens, they still have to prove their case. This is not a slam dunk that if somebody was abused, they're 70 years old, they were abused when they were 13, that doesn't mean they're going to get money. And for them, it's not about money. They still have to go to court, and they still have to prove that it happened and that they deserve this settlement. You and I talked about this earlier. For survivors, this is not really about a dollar amount. I have gone to settlements with some of the women who went to Archbishop Keough and got settlements from the Archdiocese. They didn't get much, and their attorney gets a third. So for them, it was the recognition that it happened, that the church has admitted it, and that the church is saying, we owe you something. But with most survivors, the public recognition and the process of them being able to talk freely now about what happened to them and know that a court is going to listen, that makes the difference in the world.
Yeah.
So that's what's happening right now.
There's so much there to unpack. So I'm going to
I
start
know.
back forward, but I think what you're saying is so incredibly important that, and I've already talked with some survivors in Maryland who are feeling like they're being circled by sharks. And so I will say, obviously, in full disclosure, I'm with Andreozzi and Foote. We are a law firm. I'm an advocate and a survivor myself. I've been in this field for over 20 years. I work with Ben Andreozzi specifically because he cares. And because he's not your typical personal injury lawyer, he is dedicated to representing victims of sexual violence and will do so regardless of what the potential outcome is. One of the reasons I used him so much as an advocate is because I knew he was someone I could send a survivor to, even if there was no dollar amount at the end. Like maybe they just needed a strongly written, letter to get somebody to kind of provide therapy or things like that. So you're very well spoken in the sense that survivors do need to really take stock, do their research. These cases are not easy. And there are so many different legal gymnastics that have to be obtained in order to really get to that point that you discuss, which is, it's not about money. It's about access to information. It's about who knew what and when, and how do you get access to those documents? And then how do you hold those people accountable? And it's not as simple as a car accident lawyer or, these cases that most personal injury lawyers specialize in. So definitely, for survivors who are listening, who are maybe potentially wanting to access this law, please do your research, do your homework. Call us if you want, call other folks, call advocates, call your local rape crisis program, call survivors that you know, and make sure that the representation that you're getting is sufficient and is experienced and is trauma informed and cares more about you than the financial outcome.
I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
I often say a lot of people get in touch with me. They must think I'm like doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, president, pope, whatever. I'm not. I'm a retired teacher and I care. And I was not abused. So it offers me a little bit of an emotional divorce from the actual happenings. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I've heard horrendous stories and I hate to say it, but I've gotten used to hearing it. And, I used to get off the phone and start crying afterwards, but I've gotten my wits about me with that. And I feel like I can be effective in helping people. But what I tell them when they contact me is, number one, make a police report, even if it happened a long time ago, to the sex crimes detective in the jurisdiction where it happened. So even if it's not happening now, we'll obviously do it now, but make sure that some law enforcement knows that this happened to you in this jurisdiction, and the who, what, when, where, that's all really important. I tell them find a therapist, and I tell them they can go to the American Psychology Association website and click on their state and look for therapists that are trained in working with abuse survivors. They can filter whether they want to do Zoom or phone call or in person. All the fees are right up there. It's a really good resource. So I tell them law enforcement, therapist, attorney. And to find an attorney that is going to be able to represent you is maybe a big challenge, but now would be the time, if you're in Maryland, or if this statute of limitations being eliminated affects you, now would be the time to set up your support system. And by that, I mean, if you haven't talked to your family, it's a good time to do that. Find a friend, find a spouse, not somebody else's spouse, but find somebody that can go with you. You're going to have to meet with people, whether by Zoom or in person, and it's not easy. So we feel like this is a gift to survivors to be able to do this, but it's a gift that comes with some rigorous factors that they're going to have to deal with. And I would, if they're getting phone calls from attorneys, I would probably say, thanks, but no thanks, and then do your own research. Collect names, but do your own research. As an advocate right now, and this is not an advertisement, but I'm being represented by the Jenner law firm in Baltimore, who has put a lot of time, effort, and money into this bill in terms of testifying, filing motions with the judge. It was Jenner, and the Maryland Crime Victims Resource Center, Kurt Wolfgang, who was able to move this forward by filing motions with that judge. And a lot of people don't know that, and they're not getting anything for it. They're trying to help people know what to do and how to get there. So again, the police, a therapist, attorney, and your support system. And if you don't have any of that, I'm available by, you can, I have a website, there's a contact form there. My website is gemmahoskins.com. It's very easy to remember. And if you're having trouble finding somebody and you're in Maryland, make sure your attorney is licensed to practice in Maryland. Believe it or not, some attorneys will say they are, and they'll string you along, and that's no good. So you need to take care of yourself right now.
Yeah, definitely. It's really great advice. And I love the advice about the therapist. The therapist resource is just as vital in terms of researching and making sure that you're going with a credentialed therapist, a trauma-informed therapist, one that practices in modalities that speak directly to child sexual abuse and trauma, because there are also, just as there are attorneys out there who are maybe not in it for the right reason, there's a lot of therapists too who will represent themselves in such a way, but don't really have the experience and training to really help survivors get to that beautiful place of healing that does exist, right? You know, we talk a lot about how awful sexual abuse is, and it is, and we talk about the damages and the lifelong costs and all of the, you know, horrific impacts. We don't often talk about like that place beyond all of that, right? Where that post-traumatic growth lives and where survivorship and sisterhood and, you know, hope lies. And it really does. I mean, I'm a survivor from the 1980s, and it's taken me a while finding those right therapists. But, you know, one of the reasons I continue to speak out is to let survivors know that that place exists, that hope and that peace is there. For so many of survivors, though, that have been silenced for decades and decades, this access to justice is a big piece to that puzzle for them to heal, right? Because without that validation, I think you spoke really eloquently about, you know, justice in this realm isn't just about money, it's about being validated. And often when crimes occur, the only real validation we can get is within our systems, within our justice systems. And the criminal statute of limitations are, you know, not an option for any of these survivors because we can't retroactively change criminal statutes, but we can with civil. And that's why we focus so much on civil as the remedy for survivors to get that access to justice. And so for folks that don't understand civil proceedings and just think, oh, it's just for money, you know, there are bigger things at stake. There is access to records, right? And no one has seen more than the Catholic Church, right? We have seen grand jury after grand jury being used to access those records to prove that for decades and decades, all the way up to the Vatican, the Catholic Church knew and actively covered up this abuse, moved predators from diocese to diocese, knowing that there were victims. And so, and again, this isn't just a Catholic Church issue. We know that this is widespread among all organizations, schools, colleges, universities. But the civil system is what gives you that access to those records, because otherwise you can't access it. And you also can't speak out about it because you could face criminal consequences yourself or civil consequences yourself, because until you can prove in a court of law that this did happen and that so-and-so is responsible, you really run some dangers in trying to speak out. So there's so much in this bill that is a healing component for survivors. Yes,
I think that's often hard for survivors to think about that far in the future, but because they're going to run into some bumps. This is opening the door for them to get into a courtroom. This is not saying that what they hope happens has happened. So there's going to be some bumps and curves along the way, but and I, you know, when I think about the institutions involved, that I have like this picture in my head of a little person looking up at a huge building, and that is very overwhelming because they're facing that institution alone. But they don't have to do that anymore with this bill. They have a whole a whole support system behind them and with them. And I don't know if your viewers and listeners know that right now in Maryland, we have come to the end of a 4-year criminal investigation into clergy abuse. And I don't know that it's coincidental that it's happening at the same time. Our General Assembly, it always meets in January to April, but that report was completed in November and it still has not been released yet. So it's all a process. What's happening right now, and it could happen today or next week, is that the judge who is responsible for the release of the report has given it the okay. The Attorney General, who wants this released, is working with the church to put together a list of individuals who are named in the report who, by their own rights, need to be contacted. Not everybody named in the report did something wrong. And I'll just give an example. Let's suppose somebody was abused by a priest and he sent her home in a taxi. And she knows the taxi driver's name and he can vouch for the fact that she got in and was sick or was crying. Well, that taxi driver didn't do anything wrong. So his name should be protected. So that's just one example. So right now we are waiting for the redacted interim, INTERIM report to be released. There will be many, many names redacted, but the situations will not be. No survivors' names are in the report because they made the report to the criminal investigator confidentially. So their names can't be used. But people like you and I, Jennifer, can look at a document like that. And just because we've heard so much from so many people who were victimized, we can probably guess what names have been crossed out. So the next step here in Maryland will be for the Attorney General to make what's called a good faith effort, which means they're not going to bend over backwards for the next year, to contact these individuals and to let them know that their name is in the report. And then that individual has the prerogative of pleading their case to the judge, Judge Taylor, about why their name should not be released. Now, ironically, many of those people have been hiding. So if they decided to go to the Caribbean when they saw that the report was coming out, or they were nailed for abuse in 6 parishes and they took off for Ireland, well, if they're hiding, the Attorney General is not going to send an investigator to Ireland to find them. So it's their problem. If they don't respond or if they can't be found, the name will be released. So that will happen later this year, but the interim report will be heavily redacted. But those of us who have been living this for the last 10 years, I don't think we're going to have any I'll put myself under house arrest with a notebook to figure out who's who in there. So that's happening at the same time here, which is also going to be troubling for survivors because it's going to bring back the trauma. It's going to bring back their experience having to tell this to an investigator. But it's also going to give them a sense of relief because now that person's name is public.
And you're correct. It's no coincidence that these two things are happening at the same time. Unfortunately, it often takes our legislature having things pushed right in their face to actually act. What I think all of these grand jury reports, though, across the country and movies like The Keepers and Spotlight, what you have done is you've shown the benefit of civil lawsuits and the importance of civil lawsuits, right? Because it's that investigation, that exposure, those documents, that evidence that is necessary to prove that, yes, this person did this and they should be held accountable. And so, it's definitely no coincidence. I hope that redacted report comes out soon, but I think you bring up a really good point, and maybe we can end with this, is that, for survivors, yes, it opens the door, but it also opens their wounds. And so as you're considering whether to move forward with a civil lawsuit or to access this law, it is so important to get support. And there are so many amazing agencies in Maryland. You mentioned the Maryland Crime Victims Resource Center. They're a great resource. They have advocates, they have lawyers, they have individuals that you can consult with. There are rape crisis programs, domestic violence programs, sexual assault programs.
SNAP is a big one here. Survivors Network of those abused by priests.
Definitely have somebody in your life that you can talk with about this, that you can seek sound guidance and advice. Find that therapist if you haven't accessed therapy yet. Also, we appreciate that some folks can't afford it. And so, whether or not there is the ability to access the Crime Victims Fund in the state of Maryland,
Right.
if not, sometimes the civil lawsuit has to come first because the payment and the access to therapy
Right.
is part of that monetary award that is necessary.
Mhm.
So definitely do your research, make sure that you are surrounding yourself with people that you trust. And, let's, I know this sounds kind of odd, but let's also celebrate all of the amazing hard work that individuals like you and other survivors have done to get to this moment.
They deserve the credit. We're just the spokespeople for them, Jennifer. They deserve the credit, and people like you deserve the credit because it happened to you. And you still have the strength to help other people through the forest.
I think that's the importance, right? And I consider you a survivor as well. Homicide survivors are real. That impact is lifelong, just like any other victimization. And often it takes those of us who have been wounded the most to create the change. And these processes are exhaustive. I know, I live in Pennsylvania. I happen to be in Maryland right now. I live in Pennsylvania. We've been fighting for 17 years for this bill. And survivors are tired and they're exhausted and they feel weaponized and used. And so, take the downtime that you need to. If you start getting flooded with calls from the media, it's okay to say no. It's okay to tap out and take care of yourself, because there is an army of survivors out there that can step up and do the work. And I think that's a really important lesson. So often we take this burden on our shoulders and we feel so incredibly responsible to show up every time. And sometimes that's not in our best interest. And if it's not in our best interest, then it's probably not in the best interest of the movement in that moment.
Right.
So
Right.
self-care is so important. Make sure you have those resources. Research the law firms that are kind of starting to publicize that they can take these cases. Look at the cases that they've represented. If they have reviews, look at the folks that they represented. Make sure they know this area of law like the back of their hand. Yeah. And any other advice that you would have before we end today?
Hang in there. You can do this. You are not alone. You might have to answer questions from a judge alone. And yes, you might have to face your perpetrator if they're still living, but hang in there because you can do it. You've come this far and you're not going to believe how good you feel about taking the next step forward. So
Thank you.
Nike, just do it.
Well, thank you so much for giving of your time, not only through all of this, but for us specifically today. This was really a gift to our viewers. We are going to upload this to our YouTube channel and push it out in case you didn't have a chance to watch. Again, my name is Jennifer Storm. I am the coordinator for advocacy and outreach for Andreozzi and Foote. We are a law firm that is specialized in this representation. But more importantly, we care. And if you call us, we'll resource you. And that might mean resourcing you to another attorney, to a therapist, to a rape crisis program. So just know that you can reach us at victimcivilattorneys.com or at 1-888-831-2840. Take care. Hopefully we're going to see this across the finish line very soon, and survivors' lives are going to be changed.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.